Maybe if you spent less time playing charades with a deaf Marine and more time doing actual nursing, you'd understand why protocols exist. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 42 minutes before four Marines in dress uniform walked through St. Michael's main entrance asking for Master Chief Morrison by name. Katie Morrison moves through the Philadelphia hospital's ICU with practiced invisibility. 8 months into her placement at St. Michael's, she knows exactly how to blend in, how to occupy space without commanding it, how to make rounds without drawing attention, how to become the kind of nurse that senior physicians forget they even hired. The fluorescent lights overhead hum their constant electrical prayer, reflecting off stainless steel bedframes and white linoleum that squeaks under her shoes. The smell of antiseptic hangs heavy in the air, layered beneath something darker, the copper salt tang of human suffering, the smell that never quite washes out of scrubs no matter how many cycles you run them through the hospital laundry. She carries her clipboard today like everyone else carries theirs, but tucked inside the metal clasp is a secure satellite phone encrypted with Pentagon-grade security protocols. Her badge reads Katie Morrison, RN, with a photo taken 8 months ago specifically to make her look tired and forgettable. Her shift started at 6 in the morning. It is now 6:38 a.m. She has already made rounds on 14 patients, checked medication orders, reviewed overnight lab results, and spent exactly 12 minutes in room for 12 signing to James Chen, the deaf retired Marine, teaching him the sign for water when he'd already known it for 40 years but seemed to need the conversation more than the hydration. James Chen is the reason she is here. James Chen and the 13 other Marines who came back from that deployment in Baghdad exhibiting the same deteriorating symptoms. Tremors. Cognitive decline. Peripheral neuropathy that progressed faster than any known pathology should allow. The Pentagon had no answers. The VA had filed him into a disability category and moved on. But Katie, Master Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison, with 16 years of embedded medical operations across 3 combat zones and a service record that included things that would never be declassified, Katie knew that something in that convoy exposure in Baghdad was still active, still spreading, still killing her brothers in arms one slowly deteriorating year at a time. She had saved James Chen's life once already. That was 2009. A Humvee taking fire in Fallujah, Jolan district. An IED that turned the vehicle into a burning metal coffin. She was 32 years old then, younger by most measures but ancient by the standards of modern warfare, and she didn't hesitate when the blast wave threw James Chen 15 feet from the smoking wreckage. She ran. She dragged him out. She refused medevac until every other Marine in the convoy was accounted for. Shrapnel caught her left forearm, the wound she still had, now a pale scar hidden under long sleeves, a scar that tightened sometimes when she thought about what she'd left buried in that desert. She was not about to let him die on a hospital bed in Philadelphia because a cardiologist with a God complex and an Ivy League pedigree decided discharge protocols mattered more than actual medicine. The combat boots sit in her locker on the 4th floor. She wrapped them in plastic 2 weeks ago and has checked on them 7 times since, though she can never quite explain to herself why. They are not her boots. They are his boots. They are the boots she pulled off his feet when she was trying to stanch a bleed that would have killed him in 4 minutes, boots she'd carried out of Fallujah and never returned, boots that had been sitting in a footlocker at her apartment in Arlington for 16 years until the Pentagon called her in and gave her this assignment and told her she needed something to tether her to the patient, something to remind her what she was protecting. Katie Morrison does not have children. She does not have a husband. She does not have the kind of life that lets you settle into one place for very long. But she has those boots. And she has James Chen. And she has exactly 42 minutes before the moment that changed everything. The nurse's station buzzes with the particular energy of morning shift change. Night shift nurses are drawing reports in rapid-fire bursts, room for 07 stable, vitals Q4, down 2 units overnight, while day shift staff are filtering in like pilots checking cockpit systems before takeoff. Katie stands at the far end of the counter, entering lab results into the electronic health record system. Her posture is correct but not commanding. Her expression is concentrated but not intense. She is the kind of nurse you would not notice if you walked past her, the kind of nurse that people describe afterward as a very competent, I think, as if competence were a neutral quality rather than something that marked you as dangerous in an institutional hierarchy where competence threatens authority. Dr. Whitfield arrives at 6:33 a.m. Not unusual. Not unexpected. He moves through the ICU like a man accustomed to the air parting for him, like the space itself reorganizes to accommodate his presence. He is 53 years old with silver threading through dark hair that he styles with something expensive, everything about him suggesting old money and older credentials. He walks with the particular stride of a man who has never been questioned by anyone who mattered. He stops at Katie's shoulder. "Room for 12, he says. Katie does not look up from her charting. "Good morning, Dr. Whitfield." "The discharge order. When did you write the note?" "I didn't write the note, doctor." "That would be your order to write." She can feel him calculating. The air temperature around him drops by several degrees. He is trying to decide if she is challenging him or simply answering a question, because men like Dr. Whitfield often cannot distinguish between the two. "I'm aware of the hierarchy of authority, Nurse Morrison. What I'm asking is whether you have any clinical concerns about the discharge timeline for Mr. Chen given his current lab values, or if you're simply going to continue wasting everyone's time." Katie's jaw tightens. Not visibly. Not to anyone who is not trained to recognize military micro-expressions, the kind of thing you learn in 16 years of being the quietest person in rooms where the loudest person has control over whether you live or die. She finishes typing the last entry and turns to face him. "His potassium is low," she says. "His creatinine is elevated from baseline. His cognitive function has declined measurably since admission. I would recommend." "You would recommend?" "You." He laughs. Not a warm sound. The kind of laugh designed to fracture something. "You're a nurse, Ms. Morrison. You follow protocols. You do not recommend. You execute. Those are categorically different functions, and I would appreciate if you understood the distinction." He turns to address the residents clustering near the medication cart. 3 of them. All of them men. All of them young enough to still believe that authority and correctness were synonymous. He says it loud enough for the whole unit to hear, which is the entire point. This is what happens when people spend too much time playing charades with patients who cannot hear their instructions in the first place. When you spend your shift gesticulating at the deaf Marine instead of following the discharge protocols that actually exist for reasons, you lose perspective. You start to think your emotional investment in a patient supersedes the clinical standard of care. It does not. Protocol supersedes emotion. Every single time. The ICU does not go completely silent. A ventilator hisses. A monitor beeps in steady rhythm from somewhere down the hall. A nurse at the far end of the unit adjusts and fall line. But the conversation around Katie stops. The air becomes aware of itself. She does not flinch. She does not look away. She does not defend herself. What she does instead is something far more dangerous. She closes her eyes for exactly 2 seconds, and when she opens them again, something in her expression has shifted so minutely that only someone trained to read combat faces would notice it. A line of clarity. A settling of something internal. "Understood, Dr. Whitfield," she says. Her voice has changed. Not in pitch. In weight. In the kind of authority that comes from having given orders that people obeyed because their lives depended on following them correctly. It is subtle enough that he misses it. Men like Dr. Whitfield often miss things because they are too accustomed to being right to notice when something dangerous is standing directly in front of them. He continues. "If you cannot separate your nursing duties from your inappropriate emotional attachments, I will have security escort you from the unit. And I will file a notice with hospital administration that your termination was recommended for cause. That will follow you to every nursing position you ever apply for. Do you understand?" "I understand." The words are polite. Compliant. Everything about her body language suggests deference. But Katie Morrison is not a nurse who is afraid of losing a job. Katie Morrison is a Master Chief Petty Officer who has spent 16 years in situations where losing her job was the best possible outcome, situations where the real cost of failure was measured in body counts and classified intelligence breaches. A hospital job is not a career. It is a cover. And she is so far past the point of being worried about her cover being blown by a cardiologist with a superiority complex that she can actually feel the weight of the genuine problem settling into her chest. James Chen is declining. His condition is deteriorating faster than it should. The Pentagon wants answers about what was in that exposure, what is eating through the neural tissue of 14 Marines, what might be spreading beyond them. And the only way to get those answers is to keep James Chen in this hospital until they understand what is killing him. But Dr. Whitfield wants him gone. And Dr. Whitfield has the authority to make that happen if she cannot stop him without revealing who she actually is. Katie finishes her shift at 2 in the afternoon. She does not speak to Dr. Whitfield again. She does not speak to the residents. She completes her charting with the kind of meticulous precision that leaves no room for criticism. Then she goes to the break room on the 4th floor and pours a cup of coffee that tastes like it has been sitting in a thermal carafe since 6 in the morning. She stands alone. She does not cry. She does not rage. She simply grips the mug hard enough that her knuckles turn white and stares out the window at Philadelphia stretching gray and industrial beneath an overcast sky. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead. A sound like electricity having a conversation with itself. She goes to her locker. For floors down, in the basement level where the staff lockers are kept, where nobody particularly looks at anybody else. She spins the combination. 23, 7, 19. She opens the door. On the top shelf, wrapped carefully in clear plastic, are the combat boots from 2009. James Chen's boots. She unwraps them slowly. Dust comes off them like old prayers. The leather is still slightly discolored where blood had soaked into the material before she had time to clean them. She has never cleaned them. She has never even washed her hands after touching them. She sits on the bench in front of her locker and holds them and does not move for 6 minutes. Then her secure phone buzzes. Encrypted message. Single line. Status on Chen deterioration. Urgent. She wraps the boots back in plastic. She stands. She straightens her scrubs. And she goes back to work because that is what Master Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison does. She goes back to work because there are lives depending on what she figures out, because there are Marines dying, because the quiet person in the room is the only one who can actually see what is happening. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was that she had no idea Dr. Whitfield had already decided to end this. Tuesday morning arrived with the weight of institutional power. 14 residents crowded into the Grand Rounds conference room at St. Michael's, their notebooks open, their pens ready, their eyes tracking Dr. Whitfield as he moved through slides with the precision of a surgeon. Katie stood against the back wall, her posture perfect, her face a mask of professional neutrality that would have fooled anyone who hadn't been trained to recognize the difference between composure and invisibility. Nurse Morrison here believes her feelings matter more than discharge protocols, Dr. Whitfield announced, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had never once been questioned. He projected Katie's patient notes on the screen, her meticulous documentation of James Chen's communication barriers, her careful notation of his deteriorating condition, her recommendation for continued monitoring before discharge. The notes were professional. They were thorough. They were the work of someone who actually cared whether a patient lived or died. Whitfield treated them like evidence of incompetence. She's been coddling the patient in 412, a deaf veteran who, according to her excessive documentation, needs special accommodations we frankly don't have resources for. He made air quotes with his fingers, the gesture slow and mocking. 3 attending physicians exchanged glances. The nursing supervisor's jaw tightened. One resident actually smirked. Katie's own jaw clenched almost imperceptibly. The kind of clench that came from somewhere deep, not anger, but restraint, the physical manifestation of someone holding back a truth too dangerous to speak aloud. Her hands remained folded in front of her. Her eyes stayed level. Perhaps Nurse Soft Touch can explain to the residents why emotional connection trumps evidence-based medicine. Whitfield turned to her, his smile the kind that predators wear. The residents laughed, nervous and sharp, the kind of laughter that happens when junior doctors are trying to impress a senior one who clearly enjoys humiliation. Katie's voice when she spoke was measured, each word placed like a surgical instrument. His cochlear implant candidacy requires documentation of communication barriers affecting treatment compliance, doctor. It's protocol. She didn't say, I'm documenting what you're deliberately ignoring. She didn't say, this patient is dying and you're too arrogant to notice. She didn't say anything that would crack her cover or reveal the fact that she knew his vitals better than he did, that she'd been running private blood samples through Pentagon contacts for a month, that James Chen's deterioration matched a chemical exposure signature from Baghdad, that his case might be connected to a dozen other veterans currently dying in VA hospitals across the country with no diagnosis. Whitfield's smile didn't reach his eyes. Thank you for that stunning insight. Moving on. He switched slides. The resident scribbled notes. The moment passed as if it never happened, except it had happened, and Katie felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders like a weighted vest that wouldn't come off. 2 days later, by the third-floor vending machines, Whitfield staged his second performance. This one was smaller, more intimate, which somehow made it worse. The residents waited for their coffee, drowsy from a morning of patient rounds, when Whitfield appeared beside them with Katie's presence like a deliberate prop in a play he'd already written the ending for. There she is, sign language Sally, he announced, loud enough that 2 nurses at the opposite end of the corridor stopped and looked. Tell me, Morrison, when you're busy learning hand gestures for one patient, who's monitoring the other 7 on your floor? He gestured toward her as if she were an exhibit, a cautionary tale about the dangers of caring too much. One resident snickered, an actual, audible snicker, and Katie heard the sound of it like a bell that someone had rung deliberately to mark her as prey. She selected a coffee from the machine. The cup was warm in her hands, and she gripped it maybe slightly too hard, the only tell, the only crack in the surface. She had been trained to absorb punishment without reaction. She had been trained in Baghdad to sit motionless while rounds came down like rain. She had been trained to separate her emotions from her tactical decisions the way a surgeon separates tissue layers, carefully, deliberately, with the knowledge that one mistake ruins everything. So she walked past Whitfield without responding. That's what I thought, he called after her, his voice satisfied, the voice of someone who had just proven something important to himself. The final threat came on Friday afternoon. Katie was at James Chen's bedside, adjusting his checking his oxygen saturation, noting the way his breathing had become slightly more labored overnight. The normal range was 95 to 100%. He was at 91. That wasn't normal. That was a warning sign that something was accelerating, something beyond the standard complications of his original injury. She needed more time to run the samples, more time to understand what was killing him, more time to connect the dots before Whitfield disconnected him from monitoring altogether. Remove that monitor, Whitfield said from the doorway. He wasn't asking. His posture had changed, the social theater of grand rounds was over. Now came the strategic move, the administrative power play. Patient stable. He's costing us $30,000 a day in ICU care. Discharge him to extended care facility by end of shift. Katie's hands didn't stop moving. She continued adjusting the 4 without looking up. His vitals destabilized overnight, doctor. Oxygen saturation 91. I'd recommend. I didn't ask for a recommendation, Nurse Morrison. She looked up then. Their eyes met, and for a moment the world compressed into that space between them, the space where power lived and breathed and took the shape of institutional hierarchy. Whitfield stepped closer. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped, the threatening kind of quiet that carries further than shouting ever could. If you contradict my treatment plans one more time, I will personally call security and have you escorted out. Are we clear, Nurse Morrison? She met his eyes for 2 more seconds. Then she nodded once, a single, precise movement. The kind of nod that said, message received. The kind of nod that was a lie, because she had no intention of stopping anything. She would find another way. She would protect James Chen whether Whitfield liked it or not. But he didn't need to know that. She returned to charting as though he'd commented on the weather. What happened next, after Whitfield left her alone with a patient whose oxygen saturation was dropping, was that Katie's composure finally broke. Not publicly. Never publicly. But 30 minutes later, during her break, she sat alone in the break room with a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands, and for the first time in 8 months, her mask cracked. She gripped the mug with white knuckles. The ceramic was smooth and warm, and she pressed it against her sternum, feeling the heat of it through her scrubs. The break room was empty, fluorescent lights humming their permanent electronic song, the refrigerator making its clockwork mechanical sounds, the smell of stale coffee and someone's abandoned tuna sandwich creating an atmosphere of abandonment. She stared at nothing. Not the wall. Not the coffee. Nothing. This was the problem with undercover work. The cover itself became a trap. She couldn't defend herself without exposing the mission. She couldn't explain that the nursing job was never about bedside care but about staying close to James Chen until they understood what was killing him and potentially dozens of other veterans. She couldn't tell Whitfield that she had more medical expertise in her left hand than he had in his entire body, that she'd performed emergency thoracotomies in field conditions that would make his sterile surgical suite look like a 5-star resort, that she'd spent 15 years keeping people alive in circumstances where the only alternative was death. But that knowledge was locked away. That identity was sealed in a vault. The only version of herself she was allowed to be was the one Whitfield was systematically destroying. 3 hours later, Dr. Hassan found her assisting with a minor laceration repair on another patient, a construction worker who'd slipped on a ladder and opened his arm from wrist to elbow. It wasn't a complex case. Just a careful closure, good technique, attention to tension distribution so the scar would be minimal. Katie worked with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory, from 100 trauma scenarios where the difference between adequate care and excellent care was the difference between walking and crutches for the rest of your life. She started from the center of the wound and worked outward in a specific pattern, a technique that Hassan apparently recognized. He'd been watching her hands while pretending to monitor the patient's vitals, and when he saw that particular sequence of sutures, something in his expression changed. His eyes sharpened. His body language shifted from casual observation to active evaluation. "I've only seen field surgeons in Ramadi do it that way," Hassan said quietly, his voice the kind that suggested he was accessing old memories, compartments of his mind he didn't usually open. He'd been a combat medic once. He knew exactly what he was looking at. "Where did you learn that?" Katie's hands didn't pause. Not for a millisecond. The suture continued its perfect path, tension balanced, depth appropriate, angle precise. This was the thing about real military training, it lived in your body. It didn't require thought. It just happened, automatic as breathing. Had an instructor at nursing school who'd worked with Doctors Without Borders. She was incredible. Katie smiled then, the kind of smile that was constructed from exactly the right amount of gratitude and nostalgia, enough to satisfy but not so much that it seemed rehearsed. She tied off the suture with a final knot, examined her work, and stepped back. Really specialized in trauma protocols from unstable regions. Hassan nodded slowly. His eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary. Then he looked away, but something in his posture suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. He'd been in Ramadi. He knew what field surgery looked like. He knew what it felt like when someone's hands moved with the particular grace that only came from having performed procedures under circumstances that would break most people's minds. "Your instructor sounds like an interesting person," Hassan said finally, turning back to the patient's wound. But his voice carried an undertone of something, curiosity, maybe suspicion, maybe the beginning of a question he wasn't quite ready to ask aloud. Katie cleaned her hands at the sink, watching the soap foam white against her skin, watching the water rinse it away. The break room coffee was still sitting where she'd left it. The combat boots were still locked in her locker on the 3rd floor, worn leather and dusty soles, a piece of James Chen's history that no one else at St. Michael's was supposed to know she possessed. And somewhere in Whitfield's office, a file was growing thicker: complaints, concerns, documented instances of insubordination, a carefully constructed narrative that would end with her removal from the hospital and from the mission. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Whitfield had no idea what he was really destroying, and by the time he found out, it would be far too late. The email arrived at 7:43 a.m. on Tuesday, flagged urgent, routed through the hospital's administrative portal. Katie pulled it up on the break room computer while the morning shift change echoed down the corridor behind her, the usual chaos of handoffs and alarm bells that made St. Michael's sound less like a healing space and more like a construction site under siege. The subject line was crisp and impersonal: ICU assignment modification, effective immediately. Dr. Whitfield's signature floated at the bottom of the page, but his words preceded it like a general's order to retreat. Performance concerns. Inadequate protocol compliance. Need for additional supervision. Reassignment to general medical floor, effective immediately. Katie's assignment to the ICU was terminated. She didn't flinch. She read it twice, her hand steady on the keyboard, her jaw a barely perceptible line of tension. The fluorescent lights above buzzed their mechanical monotone, the sound of institutional authority translated into electrical hum. Around her, the hospital moved in its ordinary rhythm, nurses laughing over bad coffee, doctors debriefing from overnight admissions, the ventilators and monitors singing their familiar song of human vulnerability. And Katie sat motionless, understanding exactly what was happening. This wasn't about performance. This wasn't about protocol. This was a chess move, and it had James Chen's name on it. She read the paperwork a third time, noting the date stamp, the reference number, the careful bureaucratic language that made isolation sound like administrative efficiency. Whitfield had documented everything. Every time she'd contradicted him. Every moment she'd pushed back on his treatment decisions. Every instant she'd spoken up for a patient instead of following orders. He'd catalogued her compassion like it was a disciplinary violation, filed it away with the precision of a prosecutor building a case, and now he was executing the endgame: remove her from the ICU, separate her from James Chen in room for 12, neutralize her access before she could do any more damage to his authority. The problem was that James Chen wasn't just another patient. Not to her. Not to the Pentagon. And not to the mission that had placed her in this hospital in the first place. Katie closed the email and stared at the screen. 12 years of military service. 3 combat tours. 2 Purple Hearts. A Navy Cross citation. All of it meaningless if she couldn't stay close enough to protect the veteran who'd been deteriorating in that ICU bed for the past 8 months, the veteran whose exposure to an unknown chemical agent in Baghdad might be the key to understanding why a dozen other Marines were experiencing the same symptoms. The ones in San Diego. The ones at Walter Reed. The ones whose conditions were classified well above her pay grade but whose medical trajectory she'd been documenting in encrypted reports to a handler she only knew by voice over a Pentagon direct line. And Whitfield, who had no idea who she really was, no concept of the operational security he'd just blown through, no understanding of the national security implications he was cheerfully undermining with his administrative petulance, had just removed her from the equation. She printed the email, folded it once, and tucked it into her scrub pocket alongside the challenge coin she carried from her last deployment. The metal felt cold against her ribs. By mid-morning, Katie had changed into her assigned general medical floor scrubs, a different shade of blue that felt like a uniform, though not the one she'd ever wanted to wear again, and began the process of transferring her charts and equipment away from the ICU. She moved methodically, the way she'd been trained to move in hostile territory, efficient, deliberate, without unnecessary emotion. Her belongings occupied exactly half a locker in the nurse's station. A stethoscope. A pen. A small notebook. The worn combat boots James had worn the day she pulled him from a burning Humvee in 2009, boots she'd recovered after his evacuation, boots she'd kept as proof that at least one rescue had stuck. By 11 a.m., she was assigned to the general medical floor, room 714, a diabetic patient in recovery from minor surgery, room 718, an elderly woman with pneumonia, room 722, a man post-operative from a hernia repair. All of them required attention. None of them required her specific skill set. None of them required her to be a Master Chief Petty Officer with embedded medical intelligence training and the kind of tactical knowledge that turned a simple nurse into a specialist in recognizing biological warfare symptoms in their early stages. Whitfield found her at the nurse's station just before lunch. He moved with the confidence of a man who'd won, his white coat pristine, his name badge catching the fluorescent glare like a medal. His presence made the air pressure change, the way a predator's arrival shifts the entire electromagnetic field of a room. He leaned against the counter with the casual dominance of someone who'd never been told no by institutional authority. "Nurse Morrison." His voice was smooth as diesel exhaust, that particular texture of false friendliness that masked complete contempt. Settling in on General Med. Katie didn't look up from the chart she was reviewing. "Yes, Doctor." "Good." He paused, giving her exactly enough time to think he might walk away. "I want to be clear about something. Your assignment to the ICU was a trial period based on Dr. Hassan's recommendation. Unfortunately, that trial period has concluded. The patient in 412, Mr. Chen, has been assigned a new care team. Experienced staff. Staff who understand the importance of following protocol rather than becoming emotionally invested in individual patients." Her hands remained steady. Her breathing remained even. The chart in front of her might as well have been printed in Sanskrit because she wasn't reading a single word anymore. She was calculating response angles, assessing the threat level of his statement, running through her mental inventory of the Pentagon's classified protocols regarding operational compromise. "I understand, Doctor. I hope you do." He straightened, preparing to leave, then turned back with the particular cruelty of someone who'd thought of one more thing to say. "Because if I find you on the ICU floor checking on that patient, if you so much as walk past room for 12, it will be documented as insubordination. And your employment history here is already beginning to concern the administration. Do you follow me?" "Yes, Doctor." He left. Katie set down her pen and waited for her hands to stop being steady before she realized they hadn't started shaking. The trembling she'd braced herself for never came. Instead, she felt something older, something harder, the cold clarity of a soldier taking fire and assessing the situation with perfect operational focus. Her pulse didn't elevate. Her breathing didn't quicken. This was old territory. This was familiar ground. This was what it felt like when the mission went sideways and you had to adapt. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that by 2 p.m., Katie accessed James Chen's chart remotely using her staff login, a violation of protocol, a breach of hospital policy, a federal crime if anyone was monitoring, and discovered that Whitfield had already begun the process. The notation was buried in the medical records administrative section, filed under treatment plan modifications. James's condition had been classified as unstable and requiring intervention. The consultant cardiologist, Dr. Marcus Sterling, a colleague who owed Whitfield a favor from some golf tournament 5 years ago, had recommended a cardiac catheterization to evaluate what Sterling's note described as the possible structural abnormalities contributing to arrhythmic episodes. The procedure was scheduled for Thursday. Katie knew the moment she read it that Thursday would be catastrophic. She'd been documenting James's medical trajectory for 8 months. She knew his rhythm strips like she knew the terrain of Baghdad. She knew that his arrhythmias weren't cardiac, they were neurological. They were connected to whatever chemical agent had exposed him in 2009, the same agent that was currently causing deterioration in 14 other veterans across 3 military bases. The procedure Whitfield and Sterling were planning wouldn't fix anything. It would destabilize him. It would push his already fragile physiology over the edge. And it would do so in the sterile environment of a cath lab, surrounded by cardiologists instead of the trauma specialists who would actually be needed. It was textbook sabotage. Whether Whitfield understood that or not didn't matter anymore. Katie closed the chart and stared at her reflection in the darkened computer screen. A woman in blue scrubs. Dark eyes. Hair pulled back with a military precision that looked professional instead of suspicious. Nothing visible to indicate that she was looking at the face of someone whose mission had just been systematically dismantled by an administrator with a personal vendetta and absolutely no idea what he was actually destroying. She stood, clocked out, and walked to the parking garage. The rain had started sometime during her shift, the kind of Philadelphia rain that came sideways, that sounded like applause against the concrete pillars, that made everything smell like steel and wet concrete and exhaust. She sat in her car, a nondescript grey sedan that was made for blending in, for being unremarkable, and pulled out the burner phone from the glove compartment. The Pentagon direct line. Committed to memory. Never written down. She'd been given it exactly once, on her final briefing day, along with the instruction to use it only if the operation was compromised. Only if the asset was in danger. Only if the mission required escalation. She dialed. A voice answered on the second ring. Not a greeting. Just silence, waiting for her authentication. Eagle 6, Katie said, reciting her operational call sign. Asset is in immediate danger. Procedure scheduled Thursday, 0700 hours. Non-viable medical intervention. Recommend extraction. The silence lasted longer this time. Rain hammered the windshield. The voice, when it came, was clipped and precise. Maintain cover. Do not compromise. We're sending a specialist. The line went dead. Katie set the phone down on the passenger seat and watched the rain. Somewhere in the ICU, James Chen was lying in a hospital bed, deteriorating from a condition that might kill him, protected now by a care team that didn't know what they were protecting him from. And somewhere in his medical file, Dr. Whitfield had filed away the beginnings of what he believed was a complete termination of her career, a woman who'd asked too many questions, who'd cared too much about one patient, who'd gotten in the way of his authority. He was building his case carefully. She could see it in the administrative structure he was creating, in the way he was documenting her performance concerns with the meticulous precision of someone who intended to ensure she never worked in a hospital again. It wasn't just about removing her from the ICU. It was about removing her from the equation entirely. Making sure that when the investigation came, and he had to sense by now that something larger was moving beneath the surface, he could point to her file and say, I terminated her for cause. I documented everything. I was following protocol. He had no idea that the investigation wasn't about his hospital at all. It was about a chemical weapon that was killing veterans. And the Master Chief Petty Officer he'd just fired was the only person in this hospital who understood what was really happening in room for 12. By Wednesday morning, Katie was back on the general medical floor, but something had shifted in the way she moved through the hospital corridors. The deferential posture remained. The soft voice remained. The careful protocol compliance remained. But underneath, something had hardened, the way steel hardens after repeated strikes. She checked on her assigned patients. She charted. She followed orders. And at night, she sat in her car in the parking garage and waited for the Pentagon to make its next move. The specialists would come. They would arrive without warning, without explanation, and they would extract James Chen before Thursday morning. And Dr. Whitfield would watch it happen, confused and furious, knowing only that his enemy had disappeared before he could finish what he'd started. Thursday, 2:08 p.m. The cardiac catheterization lab hummed with the rhythm of machines, the ventilator's steady wheeze, the monitor's persistent beep, the soft hiss of the anesthesia delivery. James Chen lay on the table, sedated and unconscious, his chest already prepped and draped. Dr. Whitfield stood at the monitoring station, watching the fluoroscope image with the confidence of a man who had performed this procedure 412 times without complication. He didn't see what Katie Morrison would have seen instantly, the subtle widening of the cardiac silhouette, the early signs of fluid accumulation in the pericardial sac. He didn't see tamponade developing. Katie was 2 floors above in the ICU, charting vital signs for a post-operative patient, when the overhead speaker crackled to life. Code Blue, Cardiac Catheterization Lab. Code Blue, Cardiac Catheterization Lab. Her hands went still over the keyboard. Not a drill. The tone carried a specific urgency that every healthcare worker learned to recognize the way soldiers recognized incoming fire. She was already moving before the second announcement finished, badge clipped to scrubs, shoes hitting linoleum in a stride that wasn't quite running but covered ground like water finding downhill. The catheterization lab doors burst open beneath her palm. The scene inside was controlled chaos, the attending physician performing CPR with mechanical precision, the nurse manager calling out compression rates, the tech monitoring the defibrillator pads. 30 seconds into the code, Katie's eyes locked on the monitor. Electrical activity present. No pulse. The rhythm looked correct on paper, but the patient wasn't responding. Her training, the combat training, the trauma training, the thousands of hours in field hospitals and battalion aid stations, recognized what everyone else in this room missed. Tamponade. The fluid pressure around James's heart was preventing it from filling. No amount of chest compressions would fix this. He needed an open chest. He needed hands inside. He needed it now. He needs an emergency thoracotomy, Katie said. The words came out flat, informational, the voice of someone stating a fact about the weather. The attending physician didn't look up from the compressions. We're in the middle of a code, nurse. Step back and monitor the monitor. Katie didn't step back. Her eyes moved to the crash cart 3 feet away, registered the location of the scalpel, calculated the incision site. Muscle memory took over. Not the memory of a nurse. The memory of a Marine combat surgeon who had opened chests in the dark, in the dust, in the back of a Humvee racing toward forward operating base shank with incoming round still whining overhead. She reached for the scalpel. Her hand moved steady as surgical laser. The blade was cool against her palm. She positioned herself at James's left side, just below the nipple line, 5th intercostal space, mid-clavicular. The attending tried to move toward her, but Katie's voice cut through the room like a blade through muscle. Don't touch me. Not a request. A command. The kind of voice that made the attending's body recognize an authority he couldn't quite place, and he froze. The scalpel went in with controlled precision. One long incision from sternum to mid-axillary line, the blade parting skin and subcutaneous tissue like water. Blood welled immediately, not a fountain, but steady, dark. Katie's left hand was already moving, fingers spreading the incision, muscle memory guiding her through tissue planes she hadn't touched in 14 years but hadn't forgotten. The ribs were there, exactly where they should be, and she needed inside the chest cavity, needed access to the pericardium. Rib spreader. Now, she said, and someone, the trauma surgeon who'd been standing in the corner, the one who recognized what was happening before the others, pressed the instrument into her open hand. She placed it, turned the handle, and the ribs spread open like a surgical door. Blood and fluid poured out, the tamponade draining as the pressure released. And there was the heart, James Chen's heart, pale and struggling and no longer beating. Katie's right hand went in. Her bare hand, no glove, no barrier between her skin and his chest cavity. The heart felt exactly like she remembered, warm and slick and impossibly fragile. She wrapped her fingers around the left ventricle and began compressions. Direct cardiac massage. Open chest CPR. The kind of thing they taught in trauma courses as a last resort measure. The kind of thing that almost never worked. The kind of thing that sometimes saved a life. 2 units O negative. Push now, Katie commanded. Someone was already moving. Get me a rib spreader wider than this, I need better exposure. And call cardiothoracic. Tell them it's tamponade from the catheterization. They need to prep an OR. This patient is going up emergently. Her voice carried through the room like a radio operator calling through static, calm, precise, absolutely certain. Every person in that catheterization lab responded to the authority in her tone the way troops respond to a sergeant who has been in firefights before. She knew what she was doing. Her hands knew. Her voice knew. There was no room for doubt. 1 minute. The heart responded under her compressions, a flutter, then a stronger contraction. The monitor showed the beginning of sinus rhythm. 70 beats per minute. Climbing. Katie's fingers monitored the cardiac output directly, feeling the strengthening pulse against her palm. 2 minutes. 3. Sweat dripped from her temple, but her hands never wavered. The room had gone quiet except for the monitor, the ventilator, and Katie's voice calling out status. Perfusion improving. Stay with compressions. We need those units now. Someone placed bags of blood in her field of vision. The trauma surgeon was already prepping the site for a chest tube. This patient would need cardiothoracic. This patient would need an operating room. But this patient would get there alive because Katie Morrison's hands, the hands that had been steady under fire in Baghdad, the hands that had pulled James Chen from a burning Humvee, the hands that had been carrying guilt and secrets for 14 years, refused to let him die. For minutes. 5. The heart was beating strongly now, the monitor showing a rhythm that looked almost normal, the O2 saturation climbing through the 80s. James Chen's body was perfusing. His brain was getting oxygen. Every second that passed was a second he stayed viable, a second that mattered, a second that meant the surgical team upstairs had a patient worth saving. 6 minutes. 7. The cardiothoracic team burst through the doors, gowned and ready, and the attending surgeon took one look at the open chest and the Master Chief Petty Officer with her hand inside it and said only, "Get him up to OR. Now." Katie withdrew her hand slowly, allowing the trauma surgeon to take over the manual compressions while the room shifted into transport mode. James Chen's chest was prepped for the move. Cardiac monitor was portable. Oxygen was flowing. He was alive. Not stable, not safe, but alive enough. That was the mission. Keep him alive long enough for the professionals to take over. Accomplished. Katie moved to the scrub sink and turned on the water. Blood washed from her hands in swirls of red and pink, the water running warm and mechanical, and she watched it drain away without any particular feeling at all. She had done the right thing. She had saved James Chen's life. She had also, in doing so, destroyed her cover entirely. No nurse learned thoracotomy technique in nursing school. No nurse performed open-chest cardiac massage with the precision of someone who had done it under fire. No nurse carried that kind of authority in her voice. Dr. Whitfield walked into the ICU exactly 42 minutes later. He was not alone. He moved like a man being carried on a wave of institutional power, 2 board members in his wake, both of them looking uncomfortable, both of them with the resigned expression of people who had been called in to witness something they didn't want to see. Behind them came the state medical board investigator, a thin woman with a paper-thin folder and eyes that had reviewed thousands of disciplinary cases. And in Whitfield's hands was a file. Not a thin file. A thick file, the kind of file that took weeks to build, the kind of file that meant documentation, witnesses, fabricated complaints carefully worded to sound plausible. Katie Morrison, Whitfield said. He used her full name, formal and cold. You are terminated effective immediately for performing procedures catastrophically beyond the scope of nursing practice, endangering patient safety, and direct insubordination. He said it loudly enough that the entire ICU staff heard. He said it in front of the board members and the state investigator. He said it like a man delivering a sentence he had been fantasizing about delivering for weeks. This facility will be forwarding your credentials to the state licensing board for review and potential revocation. Security will escort you from the premises. The ICU staff stopped moving. All of them. The monitor beeping seemed to get louder. The ventilators seemed to get louder. The fluorescent lights seemed to buzz with suddenly audible electricity. Katie stood up from the bedside where she had been checking James's postcode status. She turned to face Dr. Whitfield with a kind of composure that didn't belong to a nurse who had just been publicly fired. No trembling. No flush of embarrassment. No tears. Just a face like stone and eyes like winter water. She said nothing. She simply looked at him the way a predator looks at prey it has already decided to ignore. Your badge, security said quietly. He was a veteran himself, Katie recognized the bearing, and he looked like he wanted to apologize. I'm sorry, but I have to do this. Katie unpinned her badge from her scrubs and held it out. The security officer took it gently, and she watched his face register something, a flicker of uncertainty, as if he had just realized he might have misunderstood something fundamental about the situation. "Come on," he said quietly, gesturing toward the locker room. The walk through the hospital took 11 minutes. Katie's shoes, practical white Crocs, because what nurse wore anything else, echoed on linoleum. Staff members stepped aside. News of the termination had already spread through St. Michael's with the speed of electrical current. By the time she reached the locker room, everyone knew. Everyone watched. She opened her locker and retrieved her personal items, a phone charger, a half-empty bottle of lavender hand lotion, a photograph of a hiking trail in the Poconos that she had never actually hiked. And there, at the bottom, wrapped in a plastic bag, were the boots. James Chen's combat boots, the one she had retrieved from evidence lockup, the one she had been carrying secrets inside of. She held them. The security officer looked away, suddenly very interested in the floor tiles. The parking lot was empty at 8:11 p.m. October rain had been falling all afternoon, and it was still falling, tapping against the asphalt like Morse code, like a message she couldn't decode. Katie placed the boots in the passenger seat of her Subaru and drove 6 blocks to an all-night diner called Rose's, the kind of place where nobody asked questions and the coffee was perpetually mediocre. She sat in a booth by the window. The waitress brought coffee without being asked. Katie ordered nothing else. She stared at her reflection in the dark glass, a woman in scrubs, her blonde hair pulled back in a bun, her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug, her face showing absolutely nothing at all. She had saved one life. That was the mission, completed. But she had also failed the larger mission, the one that mattered more. James Chen needed answers about what was killing him. The Pentagon needed data about the Baghdad exposure. And she was now fired, exposed, out of position, unable to monitor the patient who held the answers to questions that might save dozens more lives. Her coffee went cold. 3 a.m. came and went. She stared at her reflection and thought about what failure looked like when the stakes weren't just careers or reputations. When the stakes were lives. Dozens of lives. Hundreds, potentially, if the chemical exposure pattern was what command suspected it was. She had been placed in the perfect position to answer the question. And now she was outside in the rain, holding a pair of worn boots in a rental car in a parking lot in Philadelphia, with nothing but the cold and the dark and the terrible knowledge that she might have just cost the mission everything. The hospital's morning staff meeting was interrupted at 8:56 a.m. when 4 Marines in dress uniform walked through St. Michael's main entrance and asked the front desk for Chief Morrison. Their voices carried through the atrium with the precision of people accustomed to being heard and obeyed. The receptionist looked up from her computer. The security guard, himself a Navy veteran whose posture straightened the moment he registered the uniforms, checked their credentials, then announced over the PA system with a tremor in his voice, Master Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison. "You have visitors." In Conference Room B, Dr. Whitfield was mid-sentence, presenting Katie's termination as a case study in protocol enforcement to the hospital board. He was explaining how certain nurses become emotional attachments to patients, how they lose objectivity, how they... The door opened. A 2-star general in dress blues walked in. Not escorted. Not announced. He walked to the head of the conference table, and every person in the room stood. Whitfield's mouth stayed open around a word he never finished. The general was tall in the way that rank makes certain postures automatic, shoulders like a cargo container, eyes the color of polished granite. He placed a file on the table, thick enough to require both hands, and began to read. His voice was low. It didn't need volume. Master Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison. Service record, 15 years, active duty. 3 combat tours, Iraq, Afghanistan, Kuwait. 2 Purple Hearts. He paused. A board member inhaled sharply. The general continued, each sentence its own weight. Silver Star for Leadership Under Fire, Jalalabad District, 2011. The files were opening. Whitfield's face had gone the color of institutional walls. Navy Cross for Valor in Baghdad, 2009. The general looked up. The silence in the room became a physical thing, pressing against eardrums. Current assignment, Covert Medical Intelligence Operative, Classified Status, Pentagon Medical Research Division, Authorized Level 6 clearance with active federal protection. 10 seconds of absolute silence. A fluorescent light buzzed overhead like an insect trapped in glass. Someone's coffee cup sat untouched on the conference table, steam rising like smoke from a battlefield. Then James Chen walked in. He used a walker, his gait still careful but present, and his voice when he spoke was halting but clear, the voice of someone hearing their own words for the first time through new hardware, cochlear implants processing sound with the deliberate precision of someone learning to be human twice. She took shrapnel meant for me in Baghdad. Refused medevac until every Marine was out. He paused, collected his breath like gathering coins. Didn't know until yesterday that the nurse changing my bandages was the same Marine who pulled me out of that Humvee in 2009. Didn't know she'd carried me 600 meters through open fire. Didn't know it was her hands that stopped the bleeding. Another pause. The room had stopped moving. Even the ventilation system seemed to pause. Then I got my implants activated yesterday. Could hear again. And she told me the truth. Katie stood, her spine straight, her composure absolute. The timid nurse was gone. In her place stood someone whose presence seemed to change the air pressure in the room, someone whose silence carried more authority than Whitfield's entire career had ever accumulated. The general turned to Dr. Whitfield. You interfered with a federal investigation. You compromised national security. You attempted to obstruct an operative protecting this nation's military personnel. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Your medical license is under review. You are terminated effective immediately, and a federal investigator will contact your legal counsel this afternoon regarding your conduct. The board members didn't hesitate. Agreed, the board chair said. Effective immediately. The second member nodded. Both were already calculating damage control, already planning press releases about institutional safeguards and due process and how deeply they regretted the situation. Television cameras were already positioned outside, following reports of unusual military activity at the hospital. The story had already written itself, Navy Cross recipient fired while undercover. Whitfield stood, opened his mouth, closed it. His hands had begun to shake. He looked at Katie. She didn't look back. She was looking at James Chen, and the expression on her face, for the first time in 8 months, was not composed. It was human. It was the face of someone who had saved a life and was about to save 127 more. The general shook Katie's hand. The 4 Marines saluted. James Chen walked forward slowly, carefully, and embraced her. The cameras outside captured none of it, but someone in the hospital did, a nurse, standing in the hallway, filming on her phone. By afternoon, the video had 2.3 million views. 6 months later, someone spotted Dr. Whitfield at a community college in Wilmington, Delaware, about 40 miles south of Philadelphia. He was in a basement classroom, setting up CPR training dummies with a polo shirt bearing the college logo, earning $18 per hour to teach certification students how to perform chest compressions correctly. The person who recognized him had worked at St. Michael's, had seen the headlines, had watched the federal investigation unfold through news cycles that moved with the velocity of institutional collapse. Whitfield looked different without scrubs. Smaller. The presence he'd wielded like a weapon, the casual cruelty, the institutional authority, the assumption that his position made him untouchable, all of it had calcified into something dry and hollow, like bone stripped of marrow. When he saw the person watching, he looked away quickly and turned back to the dummies, positioning their heads for the angle of compression, the same mechanical movements he was paid minimum wage to demonstrate. What had happened in the 26 hours after the general walked into that conference room was total and irreversible. The state medical board investigator he'd called in as a favor quietly distanced himself from the case. No formal charges were filed, but Whitfield's name was now in federal records as someone who had interfered with classified operations. The two board members who had supported his termination campaign received formal notifications that St. Michael's $47 million in annual federal contracts were under review. Both resigned from the board within the week and ensured everyone knew Whitfield was responsible. His medical license remained intact, barely, but his reputation had been incinerated. Television coverage ran for 3 days straight. His name in every headline. Medical schools removed his curriculum vitae from their websites. Academic positions he'd been courting for years suddenly had permanent hiring freezes. The medical conference circuit stopped returning his calls. His wife, a hospital administrator herself, asked him to move out after a reporter showed up at their home at 6 in the morning. The quiet competence he had mocked in Katie Morrison was nowhere evident in his new life, just a man who had weaponized institutional authority against someone he couldn't control and discovered too late that some people were protected by institutions that far exceeded his own. Meanwhile, 6 months after the military reveal, Katie Morrison walked through Walter Reed Medical Center in full dress uniform, Master Chief insignia gleaming, her Navy Cross positioned above 2 Purple Hearts on her chest. She had been promoted to lead the Pentagon's Medical Intelligence Division, responsible for investigating chemical exposure affecting 127 veterans across 3 combat zones. The intelligence she had gathered during 8 months undercover at St. Michael's, using James Chen as the index case, had led to identifying the compound, tracking its source, and developing treatment protocols already saving lives. James Chen walked beside her without the walker now, his cochlear implants functioning perfectly, scheduled to testify before Congress about the systemic gaps in veteran care that had allowed his condition to deteriorate for 2 years before Katie's placement. They passed a memorial mounted in the Pentagon's E-ring, combat boots, his boots, worn leather-creased and softened by years of desert operations, now bronzed and mounted under sealed glass. A plaque read, Baghdad 2009, Philadelphia 2024. For the Marines who survived and the operative who never stopped protecting them. Katie paused in front of the case. She placed her palm against the glass. James stood beside her, not speaking, understanding that some moments required only presence. Later that week, she addressed a room of newly selected military medical intelligence operatives beginning covert placements in civilian hospitals across the nation. You'll be insulted. Dismissed. Humiliated. You cannot defend yourselves without compromising the mission. People will mistake your composure for weakness. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped, carrying the weight of someone who had lived this. Let them. Your job isn't to be understood. It's to be underestimated long enough to complete the mission and save the lives only you can reach. The briefing ended. Katie walked past a television in a Pentagon corridor showing a local news story about healthcare worker shortages. A brief clip showed Dr. Whitfield demonstrating chest compressions to community college students, his face carefully angled away from the camera. Katie didn't pause. Didn't look back. She sat at her Pentagon office desk, the same pair of combat boots, now framed, mounted in shadow box with her service medals, positioned where she could see them while reviewing files on 3 more veterans exhibiting similar symptoms. Her coffee sat untouched, her focus absolute, her silence carrying the kind of authority that had cost one man everything and saved 127 lives in the process. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. If Katie's story resonated with you, please subscribe to this channel and click that notification bell so you don't miss the next story of hidden strength and institutional reckoning. Leave a comment below and tell us, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your full story? We're reading every single comment and we want to hear from you.